Hello and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk a little bit about the evaluation of writing and how sometimes people make very general statements about what is good writing, what is bad writing, what is good prose, what is bad prose. And ultimately, you can have general approaches that work better. But one of the big things to consider about literature is that context matters. The effect that the author is trying to create in the reader matters. And sometimes that means using things that the general rule says is bad. So I have a very short, simple, straightforward exercise here. I've put up on the screen, you can see it's basically like a very short sentence, but done in a couple of different ways. He grimaced. He grimaced in pain. He seemed to grimace. He seemed to grimace in pain. He seemed to grimace as if in pain. He seemed to grimace almost as if in pain. Now, you can see that this is just basically building out the sentence to make it, in essence, more ambiguous as we go down. And people will talk about the use of filler words, words that are unnecessary to the sentence. So if you compare the very bottom one, he seemed to grimace almost as if in pain. You could look at that and go, oh, you don't need all of those words. You can make the writing tighter. You can make it more specific. You can make it stronger. And that's kind of what I want to look at here. So let's look at this. He grimaced. Very straightforward. This is strong. It is direct. It is overt. It is actively describing a male character grimacing. Nothing like that. That is simple and straightforward. He grimaced in pain. Now we know why the male character is grimacing. The male character has experienced pain, and that has caused him to grimace. So again, this is very overt, very blunt, strong, direct. He seemed to grimace. Now, this is where we start building in ambiguity. He seemed to grimace. Did he or did he not? Obviously, he grimaced. He definitely did. He seemed to grimace. This is suggesting that the point of view doesn't know whether or not the person actually grimaced. It could have been. But when we consider how different points of view are used, how different people perceive things in different ways, this could be a deliberate ambiguity because the point of view character or the point of view of the narration is unsure whether or not this male character actually grimaced. He seemed to grimace in pain. So again, it's building in that ambiguity. So it's once again sort of stating that if the character did this, if they actually grimaced, it was because of pain. But they're not sure. And one of the reasons why this is interesting is he seemed to grimace in pain. Now, if it was specifically known that pain had occurred, then he grimaced in pain, we would have been fine. But if this is set in a context in which it's not necessarily a physical pain, it's not necessarily a physical action before the sentence occurs, that could explain the ambiguity, that there's something here that is suggesting pain, but it's not necessarily overt. And therefore, there is space in this sentence. There is ambiguity in this sentence to allow a reader to imagine why this is happening. And the pain itself it's being suggested that while it could be physical, it may be emotional. He seemed to grimace as if in pain. And here that ambiguity is getting even bigger. Not only is there ambiguity about whether or not it is an actual grimace, but now the question as to what has caused this momentary fleeting glimpse across someone's face, that is brought into question as if in pain. So this is suggesting, just looking at this line, that there wasn't anything physical immediately before, that whatever this character is reacting to is going to be similar to pain, but is not physical pain. It's ruled out physical pain. He seemed to grimace as if in pain. So it's actually suggesting that physical pain has not occurred, that this is something else. It's probably emotional or mental. He seemed to grimace almost as if in pain. And here we would have what people would call the weakest of these sentences. It's some people would call it wordy, filled with filler words that don't need to be there. But he seemed to grimace. So again, we have that ambiguity about whether or not the facial expression occurs, almost as if in pain. So it is absolutely ruling out pain as the cause. Because the suggestion here is this grimace, if it occurred, is because of something other than pain. He seemed to grimace almost as if in pain. So this is the type of expression that someone would show if they were in pain. But he's not in pain, therefore something else has caused this. One of the great things about the seeming to grimace is what I just alluded to, the fact that this was a fleeting moment. If we just have he grimaced, it's very clear that grimacing took place. But by saying he seemed to grimace, then there is the implication that this was a momentary or fleeting glimpse of something that flashed across someone's face. So rather than it just even being about the ambiguity of whether or not the facial expression was a grimace, it's also telling us something about the duration of this facial expression. So you can see each of these moving from very overt, strong, direct writing to much more ambiguous, and some people would say weaker writing. He seemed to grimace almost as if in pain, but the effect and the information being communicated to the reader is actually different in each circumstance. And with this incremental change, we can sort of map it out. We can see how this is different. That it's not, he seemed to grimace almost as if in pain is not a replacement for he grimaced in pain. They're communicating two very different things. He seemed to grimace is not the same as he grimaced. He seemed to grimace is implying ambiguity in the person viewing it, that they are not sure, almost as if in pain. So this is highlighting that this is the kind of expression, if this is the expression that occurred, this is the kind of expression that would happen if you were in pain. But it's not that, it's almost that. Therefore, it is something else. And so when we look at this, in terms of strong to weak, it flows down this list. Strong, overt, direct language, which, depending on circumstance, might be exactly what an author wants. But the further we get down this list, the more space there is for ambiguity. And if an author is trying to create ambiguity in perception, to allow that space in the text for a reader to inhabit and to start thinking about why these things are occurring, then he seemed to grimace almost as if in pain is actually a much better sentence to use than he grimaced in pain, because it's achieving a different effect or trying to create a different effect. It's communicating different information. But if we think about it in terms of telling and showing, or direct information to the reader and indirect information to the reader, overt versus covert, he grimaced in pain is the most overt. You're given not only the action, but the reason for the action. He grimaced doesn't tell you why he is grimacing, and that is allowing space for the reader to imagine this. He seemed to grimace is putting ambiguity in, because did it or did it not occur? He seemed to grimace in pain is the ambiguity is about the facial expression, but it is going to be caused by pain. He seemed to grimace as if in pain is now creating that ambiguity. It could be pain, but we're not quite sure. And then he seemed to grimace almost as if in pain. It's actually ruling out physical pain entirely. But as we move down through this list, it actually becomes more and more ambiguous. that it gets into much more about the perception of this event by the point of view character or from the direction of the narration. That the last sentence, which a lot of writing coaches will tell you that's a really bad sentence. It's very weak. It's very ambiguous. It has lots of filler words, but it's accomplishing a very different thing. And so when we talk about the evaluation of writing, you can take a section out of writing. You can look at a sentence and you can diagram the sentence and you can do a close reading of the sentence. All of these are very, very valuable. But ultimately, you have to put it back into context. You have to put it back into where it came from to see how it fits and whether it is communicating a consistent approach. Because that consistency, that coherency to narrative can be incredibly important. And that's not to say that you have to like or dislike any of these different approaches. They they can fit within a world and create the effect, or at least be attempting to create a specific effect. You don't have to like that. You might prefer if it had been more overt, if it had simply told you directly, overtly, and strongly, he grimaced in pain. You can really like that style. But he seemed to grimace almost as if in pain is a different sentence. It's accomplishing, or at least trying to accomplish, different things. It's trying to accomplish a creation of a different effect. The first, he grimaced in pain, is very clearly information, factual information delivered to a reader. He seemed to grimace almost as if in pain is creating a level of ambiguity and space within the sentence for a reader to inhabit with their own interpretation of what is going on. And then you have everything in between. So the whole point of this very, very short thing was to say, yeah, people will say, be more concise, be more direct, use strong language. But you have to be aware that that is not a rule that must be applied in all circumstances, because that creates different effects. So one of the great things about literature is that because of the sheer variety of narrative, different styles and approaches actually work better. Something that is very strong and overt and direct would be terrible in something that, in a narrative that is trying to be ambiguous, that is trying to give space to the reader to imagine things, and trying to add in that level of ambiguity to the text so that the reader is left trying to piece things together. If you had lots of factual, strong, direct, overt statements, that ruins that effect. But at the same time, if you're trying to read a narrative that is all about this sort of very specific action that's going on, something with that level of ambiguity is also going to be bad. You need the more strong and direct type of writing. And so when people make these statements and these rules going, this sentence would be better, and they take out, so he seemed to grimace almost as if in pain, and they go, well, we'll take out the almost. He seemed to grimace as if in pain. Okay, so that might work. Or they go, no, he seemed to grimace in pain. That's all that you need in that. But what you've done is you've reduced the level of ambiguity. Now, it could be in that particular context that reducing it to that level is actually optimal. But to reduce it then to he grimaced in pain, you've removed all ambiguity, and that might not actually fit with what is being conveyed. That it's not necessarily always about making things stronger and more concise. That it's not always about removing all elements of ambiguity. It's about understanding what effect is being communicated. It's understanding that these different things, although they seem very similar, are not trying to achieve the same effect in the reader. They're not trying to communicate the same information in the reader. And so, as a general rule, by all means, look at things and go, right. And this is a great practice. If you take a passage of writing How would I rewrite this? And you can go through it and you can take out a whole load of filler words. Then compare the original to the rewritten one. Is it conveying all the same information? And if it is, fantastic. If there's information that's now missing, is that information relevant and necessary? Because if it's not, fantastic. But if some of that information is necessary, how are you going to add that information back in? Well, you have to add in additional sentences. But if you add in additional sentences, that's undone the whole cutting out words to make things more economical. You're simply rearranging the words. And rearranging words can be great. Different ways to explore stuff. But as a simple exercise, take a passage and see how you would change it. What would happen if you substitute certain words, if you remove certain words, and then compare the two and go, do they say the same thing? Or are they communicating subtly different things or radically different things? That is kind of what I wanted to talk about today, because people sometimes say you must write in a certain way. You must use, or it's better to use strong language, overt language, clear language, remove the ambiguity. But if you do that, you're leaning into not only a specific style of narration, but also one that is not going to fit necessarily with what you're trying to communicate in a scene. Because sometimes that ambiguity is very necessary and they're not all the same. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.